Hello, this is April 5th, 2021. As the World Burns, I'm your host, Randall Burns. Today, our topic is gender ratio as a social, political, and economic indicator. Ray Dalio, in a recent interview, made the comment that China is ahead by every metric. I beg to differ. There's a very important metric in which China is not ahead, and that is gender ratio. China and India have both engaged in an enormous scale social experiment with some other countries in their region in selecting for male births through selective abortion and whatever other methods they're using. Now, it's an unknown what that means. We've never had countries of this size do anything like this before. There are no historical precedents. And the commentary from social scientists has been minimalistic at best. Now, there is one important set of papers from a Harvard sociologist, Marcia Guttentag, on the male-female ratio. I link in the description to a popular article in Discover magazine describing some of her work. One very important finding was that communities which are more heavily male tend to lean towards authoritarian attitudes. And further in this video, we'll discuss more on why that's important. The other thing that struck me reading it is I think she may have a possible explanation around Kondratiev waves. Kondratiev waves are a hypothetical long-run economic cycle. Their existence is controversial, but I think we can look at the mechanism in smaller communities and make a case on whether this is likely or not. That has not yet been done, but I think it could be. The other thing that this explains is the possible leap in innovation and the booms that we see after major wars, which tend historically to alter male-female ratio because of high levels of wartime casualties. Now, that's been changed slightly by modern warfare, which tends to kill more civilians, but it's still something that can be looked at historically, and I think it may be important. There is a old wives' tale in the investment industry that when women's skirts are shorter, the stock market tends to go up. That would tend to indicate that when sexual competition is greater among women, the stock market booms. It's plausible. I think it deserves to be looked at carefully. I have not seen it done yet. Another important relevant variable may be the reproduction gap in genders. Now, you ask, how can this be? Well, it can be because men historically are more likely to have more than one family in which they reproduce than women are. Men, if they get divorced, are more likely to remarry and have children with another spouse than women do. And what Jordan Peterson, the claim he made in one of his talks is that if you look at the genetic evidence, that you are likely to have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. I have not verified this yet, but it does ring true from what I know of biology and human biology in particular. So, and anytime you increase the male to female ratio, you're going to tend to increase that reproductive gap, which may be an important variable in a lot of things. Now, one thing that I don't like the way that Guttentag handled it was examination of the historic gender ratio. My own read is that when we look at history, one, male deaths in warfare and workplace accidents were much higher than they are today, particularly among young men aspiring to reproduction. There was also a tendency towards more authoritarian governments to unapologetically marginalize large blocks of the population who knew from day one that they had no chance of reproduction. And that was just the way it was. And this was part of a lot of classical societies, is my read on it. But the gender ratio also varies quite a bit from country to country. I have not seen a good examination on this. Part of it is simple biology. Gender is set at conception by male sperm. And there may be certain ethnic groups that for one reason or another tend to throw girls or boys. I think that societies that have engaged in a lot of warfare might select for male births. Societies that have had a high degree of polygyny over time might select for female births simply because, especially among people of lower economic and social status. But that is just not an issue that's been well examined yet. I'm going to refer largely to studies in the United States because that is what I'm familiar with, and that is a place where we have good, stable historical data. There is an epidemic of friendlessness among American men in contemporary America. Links to that are below. The other key thing about the United States to get is that the United States, although it is not a high average male gender, especially high average male gender ratio, and it's actually somewhat stabilized in recent terms after the baby bust. The United States has a high average level of sexual activity versus median level of sexual activity. That's documented in the Washington Post General Social Survey. And the other thing is the United States is a very diverse place, and we have communities that vary quite a bit in terms of gender ratio. So we can look at how it varies, not just within a country as a whole, but within communities in the United States. Some of this is relevant to migration patterns and political trends. There's an excellent article by Steve Saylor that I linked to a statistician's take on it, but it also links to the main article. It's on affordable family formation. His claim is that the percent of time that women spend married is an excellent predictor of how likely they are to vote for the GOP. And that seems to be just backed up empirically. The other thing relevant to this is that there is selective migration from communities that alters gender ratio. The stereotypical migration pattern in the rural Mid-South where I grew up was that women moved to the big city to get a job for the government or a major corporation. And that was just kind of a stereotype. Now, I have not looked at the statistical analysis. What I have noticed is that the most very wealthy communities tend to skew towards being more heavily female. That's the type of environment that the very wealthy tend to create for themselves. Silicon Valley is a bit of an exception, but even there, the uber rich managers live very differently than the people on the bottom in that community. And that's a kind of a weird case because there's a lot of money floating around. So even the people at the bottom of the pecking order in Silicon Valley have nominally high incomes, even if they can't afford to raise a family. So that community I know quite a bit about. It's actually a community with more men per capita than Alaska. I lived there for a number of years. Now, this is also relevant to immigration policy. The United States gender ratio is affected not only by gender ratio at birth, but by immigration policy. And people say, well, legal immigrants are women, and that's true. Legal immigrants tend to be, it tends to be women skewing towards the older women. A lot of those women have already had the children they're going to have, and they're coming to the U.S. for economic opportunities. But illegal immigration tends to be male. And this has some real implications that are important, and I describe some of the articles there. Okay, there was a lot of controversy around some of the statements Trump made about rape and illegal immigration, and some of those remarks were, in my opinion, insensitive. But I do link to, it's a kind of a confusing issue. I do link to what PolitiFact had to say about that, just so you can delve into the information a bit. I also link to a article on prostitution catering to illegal immigrants in Texas, and also exploiting illegal immigrants. I don't want to go into that in depth right now, but the bottom line is that this is a very vulnerable population. One thing that's never been adequately discussed to me is how this relates to employers and border security guards. That's the border security guards in particular is a very real public policy issue that needs some light shed on it. And one thing I think that we need to understand is that this is something that seeps over into the rest of the community, because oftentimes when somebody develops this habit, they may not stop easily, even when it's in their interest to stay out of prison to do so. And so this is something that needs further examination than we've had, okay? But it's something that does grow out of having a large community of men isolated socially and linguistically and economically from the surrounding community, and who are marginalized in a legal sense. And I've written extensively on immigration topics in general. I am not an immigrant hater. I do think we should have fewer immigrants, and the immigrants we have should be treated much better than what you see in recent years. But that is another issue. Now, we do have social communities that actively alter their gender ratio. One of them, a classic example, are the polygamous Mormons, who frequently expel young men at rather young ages so that they can maintain a high female to male ratio within their community. A link to that article describing that is in the description. I think it actually is a extreme case mirroring something that's happening in the larger society, and something that needs to be discussed. My read is that a lot of what this involves is a society with a high level of inequality, with even minor increases in the male to female ratio, can have huge implications in a lot of areas. And that's my read of what's happening in the United States. The United States is a very unequal society. Men's wages have been stagnant since 1965, which was when the big immigration expansion started. Median wealth has been stagnant at best, decreasing. We have more people with zero or negative net assets, and this has changed a lot of things. Okay, now there are people that think that, there are people that would argue that this is good. I am not among them. But the first question is to really look carefully at what is happening and why, before we go too much further with this. Now, the state of okay, it used to be that this was entirely set by acts of nature and warfare and workplace accidents. We're moving somewhat beyond that at this point, but now we have to ask ourselves, what sort of society do we really want to live in? And I don't think we necessarily know all the ramifications here. There's a lot more that's needed. I have not even started writing meticulous questions on this issue yet. I intend to, but that's kind of a painstaking process, and I wanted to get this talk started on this. I mean, I personally am inclined to think that gender ratio is an important economic indicator. It indicates a lot of things like innovation, stability. The change may be, what's also important is the changes here, not just whatever level it's at, but whenever it changes, that may be important also. And I think we've just started to really, I don't think we've even really started to look at that and ask ourselves what kind of society we want to live in and what the implications are. But in the meantime, there's a lot that's being done. I mean, we have the selective abortion technology being used in China and India. There are gender selection methods associated with in vitro fertilization that are fairly widely used. Artificial insemination, according to an obstetric nurse that I talked to, has a ramification of actually altering gender ratio in favor of female births. And she worked at a hospital where a large portion of the births were being taken place through artificial insemination, and had noticed that in the hospital. She was claiming a 70% female gender ratio in that hospital. And this is in a situation where there are huge regulatory issues. It's actually relatively hard for people that want to select for female births to get that technology, access to that technology in the US, because of regulatory and bioethical issues. It's not something that's readily available, and the policy is still somewhat confusing. And the technologies that are available right now are somewhat invasive. People doing it on either side have to have some real motivation to go that route. That may not always be the case. I mean, I can imagine a few years where there may be a pill or a douche that will enable people to select their child's gender. And I think that's coming, relatively rapidly. I wouldn't be surprised to have that in the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And I personally see this as important as birth control and the containment of sexually transmitted diseases through antibiotics. But its importance doesn't seem to be widely recognized yet. Okay, it's not something people are used to thinking of as something that is an issue impacted by technology, and a lot of folks aren't quite so clear on why it is important. Okay, I tend to have a special interest here because I went to the University of Chicago in the mid '70s when we had a 2-to-1 female or 2-to-1 male to female ratio, and I saw what that kind of social environment was like. And I really have a lot of empathy towards Chinese men after having had my college years in that environment. I really do. And I'm kind of puzzled why there isn't more discussion about this within China just yet. But I think that there eventually will be. And I think that this is going to be an issue where it's going to be discussed globally. And I am thinking about some questions for Metaculus on this issue, like, will any nation substantially alter their gender ratio the next 10, 20 years? This is going to be a kind of slow moving for that forum, but I can at least get things started in that context. So I'd love to hear from you. Please like this video if you found it useful or helpful at all. Even if you didn't, please comment. I really am dedicated to improving this content, both what I cover and how I cover it. I know there's a long ways to go. I'm painfully aware of that, but I'm doing this because I care about people and I really do want to be helpful. You take care. This is Randall Burns signing off.